Thank you for that introduction, Michael, and thank you, a big thank you as well from my part to Alan Asher and ACCAN for inviting me here today. It's always a real pleasure to visit Australia, though you didn't really have to put on the English weather for me to feel at home. What I'm going to do, I'm going to do four things today, and I'd just like to say before I start that my presentation today will be on the basis of my newly invented Rustenburg rules, which are basically, I'm not going to talk about the cricket if you don't talk about the World Cup to me. Having said that, what I'm going to do today is four things. One is I'm going to talk very briefly about what we know about complaints and complaint handling and their importance to customers and consumers. I'll move on from that to consideration of the telecommunications industry's role and its record in relation to complaint handling in Australia and the United Kingdom. I'll then talk fairly briefly about the principles that will underlie a good complaints handling system and what that ought to look like, both internally within a company and externally with an ombudsman system or equivalent. And finally, I'll end with some thoughts about where things might be going for the future and how we might make complaint handling systems better. So, first question is what we know about complaint handling. Well, we know some things which are fairly intuitive but are also backed up by the research. We know that complaint handling matters to customers and consumers, and that when they make a complaint, they don't want additional problems. They want to get the matter sorted out, and they don't want to actually have additional stress because they've complained. We also know that service failures cost companies both money and reputation, and indeed that good complaints processes can help to do the opposite. And it's worth just saying a bit more about these points. One of the things we know from the research is that there are a lot more dissatisfied consumers than are recorded as having complained in any company complaints system. The number of recorded complaints in a complaint system is just the tip of an iceberg. It's just those people who could be bothered to complain. The research suggests that there can be anywhere from 10 to up to 50 times the amount of dissatisfied consumers who haven't complained. And this is important because the research also tells us that those people who haven't complained are much more likely to vent their dissatisfaction simply by leaving the company and no longer taking the product or service. As for those people who do complain, simply the act of complaining seems to indicate that they're more likely to stick with the company. But also, of course, they talk about their experience. They talk about it to their friends, their colleagues, their neighbours, and whether they've had a good or a bad experience, this has an impact, a much wider impact on the company's reputation. And so handling the complaint well is important for that wider reputational impact. And we also know from the research that the one way of hanging on to your customers, the one way of getting customer loyalty is actually to resolve their complaint to their satisfaction. So if you've got a good complaints handling system, it's a good way of holding on to customers. It's also a valuable source of learning. This is something else that comes out from the literature and something else that people tend to pay, certainly at least pay lip service to. Complaints can tell you not only what's going wrong in your company, but they can also tell you about market opportunities, and it's worth bearing that in mind. So good complaints handling isn't simply a case of solving problems. It's also a way of moving the organization forward, of finding market opportunities for the future. And, as I say, we should remember that the numbers we see recorded in complaint systems are just a reflection of the numbers of people who might be dissatisfied. There are probably more people who are dissatisfied who haven't complained. So, how have the telecommunications industry been doing with complaints in the UK and Australia? Well, you all know, sitting here, that there is a large number of complaints to the TIO. In the last recorded year, they had about 230,000, and on the figures that were very kindly sent to me, it looks like this is going to be about the same amount this year. I must admit, when Alan sort of first rang me up and talked to me about this and told me about the statistics, I thought, he can't be right, can he? But then I rather unfortunately discovered he was right. And this is a number of complaints to an ombudsman system that, for a sector, I've never run across, certainly not in the UK. The number that I've used for comparison purposes for the same period in the UK is just under 9,000. Now, there are lots of issues about the comparability of the numbers, and I don't really want to get into that at the moment. But the message, but really you would expect the numbers to be reversed in some sense, that you would expect the UK to have higher numbers than Australia because we've got more people, we've got a larger market, but Australia has much higher numbers. And it's not, I should add, because the telecommunications companies in the UK are brilliant at complaints handling, as we shall see. In fact, the regulator in the UK, the Office of Communication, has been running a long campaign to try and improve complaints handling within the telecommunications industry, and been meeting quite a lot of resistance. So there's something perhaps about the telecommunications industry generally, which is a problem. And the other thing that's surprising to me about this is that a lot of the complaints really are about customer service. There's a number of indications of this. Ofcom in the UK reckons they get something like 1,000 complaints a month about customer service direct to them. And they don't have any jurisdiction to do anything about this. There was a survey, it's now about 3 or 4 years ago, on customer service, where it found that UK telecommunications companies, their complaint handling was worse than retailers, banks, and other utilities. Now, you might understand it being worse than retailers, but getting your complaint handling in the UK worse than banks, I see it's pretty similar to Australia. I mean, getting it worse than banks it is like being less trusted than journalists, politicians, and estate agents in the UK. To give you an idea, the banks reckon they have something like 2 million complaints a year. That's what they record. You know. And consistently, the TIO and the UK's sort of equivalent, the Office of the Telecommunications Ombudsman, have both been saying for a while that customer service is a problem in the industry, and yet there doesn't seem to be much change on this issue.